Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Thinking Christian. I am joined today by Eun Strawser, and she has written a book called Centering Discipleship, a Pathway for Multiplying Spectators into Mature Disciples. She's also the author of a forthcoming book called Sharing Leadership, both of which are published by IVP, and you can find the links to purchase those in the show notes. They'll be there. Obviously, you all know that I've been interested in discipleship for a long time. It's a kind of a recurring topic on Thinking Christian. And so I'm excited to have this conversation. And Un, thanks so much for joining.
No problem. Thanks for having me, James.
All right. Well, when I started reading through Centering Discipleship, one of the things that I really loved about this is that you're trying to draw people back to this notion that discipleship really should be the center of everything that the church is doing, and it should almost permeate the church's mission is discipleship, and everything should permeate out from that. Talk a little bit about how you came to that conclusion and what your experience in churches was that sort of drew you into this topic.
Yeah, I think that discipleship, it should be the topic that comes around over and over again, right? This is
Yeah.
probably something, a key thing that every Christian circle, every church should be talking about. And I think that that probably is like the problem when things are over spoken of or over discussed, it's probably meaning that there is a lack of definition, a lack of clarity around what it really is, right? And so I found myself in that position. Discipleship has always been really important to me. I love that IVP published my book because InterVarsity is where I really figured out, in college, right? A lot of our like common stories, right? Where we
Yeah.
really owned our own faith, thought about it. And discipleship was really central. And if you, I would be like the cream of the crop discipler because I discipled like 50 people one on one in a span of 10 years, right? Everybody loves to hear that story because they're like, oh, it must be like a super Christian because she hit that number. And I'm just like, this will not work. This is not the method by which Jesus discipled his people. This isn't the method by which, it grew from 12 intentionally lived through discipled people over 3 years' time that equated to, a change of the entire planet, right? Through discipleship, like one-on-one discipleship, 50 people over 10 years is just not the method to go by. And if you go into professional ministry, so this is my second church plant in Hawaii. Our first church plant, we did that typical, launch your church model, Sunday service, worship service, which I love and like
Mhm.
is beautiful. I love worship services.
Yeah.
We start with that. You start with like 20, volunteers, be on the church plant launch team, and then you grow your church, right? In 5 years' time, we grew that church to 450 people coming in on a weekly Sunday morning service. So it felt like success. But around year three is when I started asking that question around discipleship. I knew that we could draw a crowd of people. I knew that we were like quasi good at the sermons, right? It must be entertaining enough that people would come, right, every week.
Right.
Even though
Right.
if I like even ask my own children every week, so what you think of my sermon? They'll be like, I have no idea what you said, mom. You know what I mean? Like that's the typical like pastor's experience, right? Even though we had like awesome music that was contemporary, it related to people, it didn't matter. When I started asking my own church and around my own leadership, are we actually discipling people or are
Yeah.
we putting on a good show? Right? Like, is the church growth model around? Are we just putting on a good show? If
Yeah.
that's the case, then like that, I'm nailing it, right? But if I started asking the question around, are there more mature Christ-like people in my church today? Are there more people who have this generative sense of both patience, kindness, generosity that overflows beyond them? Is that what's really happening in my church? Is there a sense of mission and call into the neighborhoods, or people start thinking about their own workplaces as places where like God's already at work? Are people having those kinds of conversations? In reality, people weren't. They were really asking about, Oh, what a good sermon it was. Oh, the worship service was beautiful and so touching. Or at best, the learning cap was some sort of self-help ideal, right? That was what
Gotcha.
church was becoming, right? Or a place of belonging where I go to small groups so that I can recognize a face on a Sunday morning worship service and say hi and not sit by myself. That was what church, at least in our context, was becoming. So I knew that there was a huge discipleship gap. Even when we started asking our own leaders around discipleship, like the simple question was like, have you been discipled? You know, and these are people multi-generational, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And have you ever discipled anyone else? And the next question was, how do you know? How do you know for sure that you were discipled? And how do
Mm.
you know for sure that you discipled somebody else? And there was a mishmash of responses from that group, and also from like asking the same questions around a lot of vocational ministry leaders too. So I just knew that sense of that lack of definition around what discipleship is not just unique to my own local context, but pretty nationally or even worldwide.
So when you think about discipleship, one of the terms that I sort of gravitated as I read through the book was imitation. I've worked a fair amount with Renee Girard's work on mimesis and mimetic violence and those kind of things, and have thought a lot about imitation. And so, how did you land on imitation in relation to discipleship, and how does that work itself out practically? I mean, it can become a fairly ambiguous term, right? Well, let's imitate Christ. Where when we say that, we're not usually thinking let's put on robes and sandals and walk around Palestine. So, how did you sort of bring that down to the ground?
Yeah, I think imitation is the entire game in discipleship. If we don't nail this part down, then I think that, and really examine it and come back to re-examine it, I think
Yeah,
that this is probably often the root cause of unintentional, sometimes intentional, but for sure unintentional, um, quote unquote white Christianity or
sure,
Christian colonialism, right? If you think of the church historically, and many of us in vocational ministry, like we've traveled, met other leaders globally, right? We have some sort of context that
yeah,
Christianity is not just unique to America, right?
right,
And when we do that, you also see a lot of like assimilated patterns, but they're all cultural assimilations, right? They're not necessarily Christ-like patterns, right? You can
yeah,
see it in church history, artwork, right? All those kinds of things. So
yeah.
I do think that if we don't nail down and clarify what it means that discipleship is about imitation, then discipleship will ultimately imitate something or someone else's culture, and maybe not necessarily of Christ. So yeah, I think defining that is the most important thing in discipleship. I think even scripturally, a biblical history puts it as imitation more than anything else. Lots of people think that, we'll take the definition of discipleship from where the Gospels land on it, right? Jesus, whenever Jesus talks about discipleship or around the word around follow me, following me, anything like that, it really is about that rabbi, teacher, pupil, apprentice kind of wording, right? A lot of it is going to be about, follow me, because culturally people understand what apprenticeship means, right? In the modern world, apprenticeship could be like an internship, right? People think about
Yeah.
it academically, right?
Oh,
And so
100%.
I
Yeah,
I think that's why most people think that especially in Western culture, that discipleship has so much more of an emphasis on learning. It's some
yeah,
sort of learning program or learning format, and it's just limited to that, right? Even like I do a lot of consulting work with churches who want to try to center discipleship. A lot of the times, the folks who are like doing it at best, they have some sort of discipleship program, 12 week, 6 week thing. Come over the summer and learn this thing, and then once you get that like certificate of completion, great, now I'm this is what proves that I'm a disciple, right?
right.
There's nothing wrong with it, right? But I think that it's limited. But if you think about chronologically, how were the first century Christians thinking about that term discipleship or imitation, right? They were probably using the Apostle Paul's words around any time that he wrote about followers or imitating or discipleship or being a disciple, he actually used the word mimesis, right,
Yeah.
about imitation,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
copying, copycat, right. He's borrowing how the author of Hebrews talks about Christ is an imprint of God, right? It's imprint and image language that Paul uses. I think that's more true to what discipleship is, imitating, figuring out what it really means to be an image bearer, God's image bearer here on earth, right? Just like Jesus was, right? Just like
Yeah.
Jesus was a true human, right? It's really imitating Christ in not just learning about him or learning stuff about him, right? But really, how do you examine and study Christ so that you know how you should live, so that you know how you should think, so that you know what and whom and how you should love, right? And how you should behave, right? If it really is about mimesis and imitating Christ, I think that that is very different from just apprenticeship that's limited to increasing a knowledge bank. That I think a lot of Western Christians think at best what discipleship is.
Yeah, and even on the technical skills sort of side, when I think of apprenticeship, I go back to sort of, ironsmiths who would train apprentices and those kind of things. And so you have this knowledge base of things, sort of the doctrinal aspects, the propositional side of that knowing. But then there's also this procedural technical skill that maybe we teach people how to pray, we teach people how to study the Bible, we teach people how, and there's that idea of these are the skills that you need. And I'm with you. I think there's validity to that, but it is limited, because when we look at that imitation in Scripture, we see maybe even in Philippians, where we're supposed to develop the mind of Christ, and we see this beautiful picture of Jesus in Philippians 2. That embodiment of giving up his godhead and recognizing that that was not to be held for his own advantage, but giving that and setting it aside is something that you can propositionally understand, but you have to do more than procedurally know how to do that. You've got to sort of own it in a different way. Is that sort of where imitation comes in? Like sort of that actually testing God by trusting him and acting in the ways, really obeying what he's doing and reflecting back on that. Would that be a fairer way
Yeah,
to talk about it?
I think that the I think the term that Jesus used for disciple follower was a cultural term, right? In Greek is methetes, right? But
Yeah,
everybody in culture in that first century world would know what that means. If
sure.
you're an apprentice to some sort of vocation or teacher, it really is that I'm going to follow and mimic and do life and have a deeper relationship with this person because I think this person has the answer to everything that I've been thinking about or concerned about or wondering about or wanting to figure out, right? That's a very different kind of learner, right? An
Yeah.
apprentice and a learner pupil, in that first century world is very, very different from a limited set, knowledge based, only kind of learner in the Western world, right? I think that's why the Apostle Paul, used a different wording and just straight out use imitation, mimetes, as any and every time that he talks about follower of Christ or following me or disciple of anything that's related to that, he really strayed away from methetes and he used the word mimetes, imitation, as what it defining what a disciple or being a Christian really is. Yeah, and I also like that there is that tension of a real living relationship. If you're going to be imitating someone, it means that like you're not memorizing something of old. You're constantly watching and observing, and then practicing it out, and then coming back and watching and observing, having conversations. Right? If you have that kind of relationship with Christ, prayer looks a lot different.
Yeah.
Right? Reading scripture looks a lot different, right? How you're going to live out and practice living out being like Christ looks different, right? There is much more of an examination and much more of a relationship when you think about it that way.
Yeah. I'm an Old Testament guy, so I always go back to the Old Testament and kind of look at some things. But like Malachi 3 to me has always been sort of one of those passages I always go back to and think to myself, this is how imitation begins to happen. We we take the leap. In that passage, God tells the Israelites to test him by bringing their full tithe to the storehouses and to watch what he'll do. And in avoiding all the prosperity gospel sort of implications of that, you sit back and you say, what God is really asking the Israelites to do is test him by trusting him, test him through obedience. And I think that as we do that, we'll ultimately be imitating Christ, because what Christ did was just live obediently, even when obedience didn't make particular sense in a given situation. Right? It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Jesus could have done 16 other things, but in this case, he just obeys and trust that the Father is working and that it's all going to lead where he's supposed to go. And there isn't a lot of anxiety about the choices that he's making, because he's just obeying and relying, that kind of
Yeah, yeah,
cadence.
I like that you bring up that concept of testing, and full disclosure, right? There, it can be like a triggering thing. It's not really about like
Yeah.
being perfect or
Right.
pleasing, those kinds of things. But yeah, I think that if we really think about that concept of testing, you can go all the way back to Genesis, right?
Yeah.
Even in relationship, a quote unquote perfect relationship with God, right? At the
Yeah.
time of Eden, right? And human beings are created. And the first thing was a test. There was a testing on will you trust me enough?
Yeah.
Right? There is this
Yeah.
deep, deep sense of being an
Right.
image bearer and reflecting the fullness of God means that there's always going to be this like relationship tension of, do you trust that I'm for your good?
Right.
Do you trust that, like, right now when you look at something and you see that it's good and then you take it, that actually probably isn't the best thing, right?
Yeah.
I think that there it's by design and intentional that Jesus also had testings, right? Immediately,
Right. Right.
when it is ordination, right?
Yeah.
And he's confirmed by the Father, the Spirit descends upon him and immediately goes into testing because it constantly is going to be about a relationship. And I think that is the deep sense in discipleship. Why would we imitate someone that we don't love?
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
would we worship someone that we don't desire?
Mm.
Right, like that it has
Right.
to be around that. And if Jesus is our object of love and desire, going back to Gerard, right, and
Yeah.
therefore, right, why we have a sense of imitation and a longing for him, then a lot of that tension of testing should be a reality. That
Yeah.
around trusting Christ, right, and
Absolutely.
him entrusting us, right, that should be a back and forth.
Well, let me pivot the conversation. I wanted to ask you some more practical questions here. One of the things you talk about in your book is the discipleship pathway framework, right? And you suggest, let's begin with the end in mind. And then you ask several questions. What are the essentials of discipleship in your church? How are people being equipped in those essentials? And then what specific markers are we looking for to tell whether they're actually being equipped in those essentials? And so I've done some consulting in the past as well, not with churches, but mostly in higher education. And one of the things that I notice is that when I ask people to give me the essentials, they often don't know what they don't know. In other words, there's such an institutional context that when you ask that question, you're going to get basically the sort of responses that are going to reinforce the culture as opposed to transform the culture. So, how do you help church leaders get their heads around maybe different starting points would actually help us, focusing on different essentials? Maybe those things would help us move toward a discipleship culture, even though they're not really particularly comfortable for us. Right? How do you get past the basic answers of Bible study, prayer, whatever that is? Yeah. Talk through that a little bit. I'm
I
interested.
just cringed a little bit when you were like,
Yeah.
these maybe. I'm like, ugh. Yeah, I think the big ruse around my book centering discipleship is that most church leaders are like, oh, great, put her discipleship pathway that she uses in her
Sure.
church, and this is what it's going to be. And I'm just going to follow 1, 2, 3, and then voila. Our
Right.
church will also have discipleship centered. Spoiler alert, that is not why the book was written. I will say that I really, truly, truly believe in Peter's conversation around that, the priesthood of all believers. I really do
Okay.
believe that. But I also think that there is a starting point, and it
Hmm.
does start with leaders. Because discipleship is an imitation game,
Yeah.
no matter how much we say that it's not happening, the people who attend our churches really do mimic us, or they
Mm.
have some sort of pattern of what it means to be a Christian by watching us, right? And it really matters what leaders focus on, what leaders pull their resources towards, right? What leaders make an invitation for, and what leaders have ultimately a vision for, right? And
Yeah.
so the book really does have a starting point with leaders, because not because they're the only people who can disciple. That's not
Understood.
why. It's only
Right.
because of their influence over large pockets of people and
Yeah.
institutional churches, right? And so I do think that it's worth it for leaders, if anybody wants a starting point. It's not to look at programs or structures or systems. It actually is to look at our basic assumptions or values. If leaders kind of take the time to be like, where are most of our church's resources lying on? It's time resources. It's, who do we think and consider as leaders? What do our leadership pipelines look like, and why do they look like that way, right?
Hmm.
Where do our finances go towards? Where do our volunteer base go towards? If we're really honest with ourselves, I can walk into any church and tell you if discipleship is moving towards the center or it's left at the periphery
Agree.
by those kinds of topics, right? You
Sure.
kind of look at where the leader pulls their resources towards. If it's still predominantly to that Sunday morning worship service, which is, again, it's not a bad thing or a wrong thing, but if it's majority of the resources, thinking about your time, thinking about where leadership lies, or is moving towards, then it probably means that the thing that we value the most as leadership is instruction, or that sermon piece. What is the most climactic point of any Sunday morning worship service? It
Yeah.
probably is the sermon. Everything's centered around it. If you think about how a scripture is written, through Hebrews lens, that's like, everything's at the center of the book, right? That's the
Yeah.
most important thing, and everything else is oriented around it. It's the same thing, I think, in a Sunday morning worship service. What's the thing that we're saying is the most important thing? It's this instruction piece. And
Yeah.
usually that's where we think the teaching on discipleship is supposed to happen, but it's not effective if we don't have disciples, right? So I think that's one piece. I think what leaders are moving people towards, or the invitation is made towards, it's most people will think that I know that I'm a successful Christian because I invited somebody to this Sunday morning worship service.
Okay.
Phew, I'm done. I like check that box off in being a good Christian or a good disciple, because
Yeah.
I finally invited that person, and that person came. And ultimately, I think it's because most leaders have a vision. And again, there's nothing wrong with this, right? But I
Hmm.
think that ultimately leaders have a vision. If you're thinking in 5 to 10 years time, what would I imagine the life of my church to be like? Most of the time, people are going to be describing the growth or flourishing or abundance of their church.
Yeah.
If you're going to flip all of that and put it into categories around how do I know if a discipleship is being centered, you kind of look through those same kind of listings: resources, how people think about their time, finances, schedules, leadership pipelines. It really will be about imitation. If it's about
Yeah.
that, then in any and always possible, the question is always going to be, are my people being discipled? Are
Yeah.
the people who at every stage, at every age, whatever it's going to be, are they being discipled? Are they becoming more like Christ? Which means that you're going to start developing, what does it mean to look like Christ in this neighborhood, in this city, in this state, today, in this century, right? You're going to start asking those unique localized questions, right? The
Yeah.
invitation piece is going to be, you're probably going to be inviting people more towards a bigger invitation, not to Sunday morning worship services. It's going to be to the neighborhoods,
Okay.
right? You're going to be like, where do we actually live out and practice living like Christians, living Christ-like? It's not really within the church. It's really with the community that the church resides in, right? And then
Yeah.
lastly, it means that the leader probably has a vision for the flourishing of the entire community, not just their own church. If discipleship is being centered, then one of the marks of that is going to be that the neighborhood would benefit from it, and your church's existence would actually matter to the neighborhood it resides in.
Okay. So when you think through some of the practices, what comes to mind when I think about that vision of discipleship where it moves from the church out into the community? Right? There's an impact, an influence, and an intentional look toward the community. What really comes to my mind is the necessity of lament. And so there's a sense in which you could look at the data, I suppose, and do the nerd thing and kind of push up your glasses and, oh, the data suggests we have all this going on. But then there's a whole other sense when we look back at Christ and we see him being very compassionate and almost weeping over Jerusalem. There's this sense in which, in other words, there's a vision of that outside community that sees it as broken and recognizes that no matter how much we do, perhaps it won't be fixed, but that we still have a responsibility to wade into the mess. you know as a discipleship essential, is that the kind of thing you would try to lead churches toward, to look at life that way, as opposed to just sort of, we want people to master X, Y, and Z doctrines? Is
Yes.
that I know that's a little bit of an unfair comparison, but
No, no, no. I
okay.
think it's a very, very, very fair
Okay.
comparison.
Okay,
Yes.
good.
Yeah. I think that if our tools of becoming better scripture readers, our tools of being better, at praying, having the tools of being knowing how to worship better, right? If all of these tools don't lead into a compulsion of love towards our neighbor, then
Mhm.
that's not discipleship. At least it's not imitating Christ.
Yeah. And because those two are really very much tied together, and I mean, you could argue that even within the Great Commission, which you address, you have these two movements within discipleship at the very least: baptism and learning to obey all Christ commanded. And so it's an easy leap to go, well, what did Christ command? Well, there were basically two basic things: love God with everything we are and have, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so those two seem to fit really well within discipleship, and imitating Christ in that way would certainly lead to it. I guess my concern would be, and my question to you is, do you see a lot of churches that really have that have the practices embedded within them to lead them to those conclusions?
Yeah. Let me phrase my wording well in
Yeah.
this one. Yeah. Two thoughts come to mind. One is, yes, I think that when I'm working with churches and leaders, and they're just like, oh, we don't have a lot of discipleship essentials, or I don't know the clarity point. I'm just like, every church probably has it, and ultimately, every church should have the same one. It should be how Jesus defines a Shema, right?
Yeah.
Love God and love neighbor, right? That really is it, right?
Right.
But I think that if you kind of look at how Jesus talks about loving God and loving neighbor, in how like, what are the two topics that he talks about more than anything else in all of his parables, right? He actually talks about seeking two things. I think seeking those two things has to do with loving God and loving neighbor, right? He
Okay.
says, seek the ones who are far from God, and he includes those who are far from community, right? He constantly jams those two things together. It's not this privatized religion and privatized individual relationship with God. Not just that, right? But the way
Yeah.
that Jesus sees what it means to be a follower of God, right? Or a God lover, Yahweh lover, is that being closer to God means being closer and invited back into the community, right? Every healing is going to be go show yourself to the priest, right? So that you can come back into the community, right?
Yeah.
Because that is
Yeah.
part of loving God, right? So
Right.
it's like seek those who are lost meaning those who are far from God and far from community. And then he says, seek the kingdom.
Mm.
Those are the two things. I'm like, if churches
Mm.
examine what it means to not just do the rote thing of like, oh my gosh, we love God and love people, and then that's on every church's banner. Again, I love it. That's the right place to start. But if we
Yeah.
don't examine, I think scripturally and what is God's and Jesus's intent around the Shema, it really means you're seeking those who are far. Loving God means you're going to go and seek the ones who are far from Him and far from His community. That's what it means in praxis, right? If
Yeah.
it means love your neighbor, it actually means that you're going to seek His kingdom for the flourishing for your neighbors and not just yourself, right? The kingdom of God should be a flourishing, abundance. Everybody has a sense of belonging. Everybody has a sense of purpose for everybody, right? It's redeeming culture. It's redeeming creation. It's redeeming relationships, right? All of that's included when Jesus is talking about like I'm here. I inaugurated my kingdom, right? And it's growing. It's expanding constantly, right? That's what he's
Yeah.
talking about, right?
Yeah.
Every parable about it growing, starting small, growing exponentially, right? If Christians don't think about loving neighbor in that way, then I think that everything becomes so privatized and limited.
Okay.
Christianity becomes super small, right? And then
Yeah.
therefore discipleship becomes whittled down to some good learning that I had or some good class that I took at church. And now I must understand what it means to live like Christ.
Well, one of the things this connects to something I wanted to talk about a little bit, but you emphasize at various points in your book colonialism, this sort of colonial movement within discipleship. And it seems to me like what you just explained, this idea of you talk about in terms of hospitality occasionally in the book, and how going out and seeking those who are far off and trying to draw them in. It would seem to me that that's a solution to, or a at least a dynamic against, colonial understandings of discipleship, because you're welcoming others. You're not trying to force others to fit into your mold. As they imitate Christ, they're going to take on a different shape and a different form, but they're going to be moving toward Christ likeness as opposed to me likeness. And so what you just talked about, can you kind of help us understand what you mean by the colonial aspects of discipleship and maybe how it connects to those two concepts?
Yeah, I think that and this is yeah, I think that this is a hot topic. It should be a hot topic in our
Yeah.
time, right? So I'm thankful that you're the first person, James Spencer, who is asking me to have this conversation on an interview. So I really,
Really?
really, yeah, you're my
Okay.
favorite interviewer by far,
Well, there you
for
go.
sure. Yeah, oh, it like gets me a little bit tearful. I think that the biggest emphasis that a lot of church leadership, nationally and globally, actually, that we all talk about in these kinds of settings is like, what will the future church look like, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of black and white race dynamics. Everybody understands that there's a disparity, right?
Yeah.
In America, it's racism, right? But if we constantly think that a future church will either be white assimilated or black assimilated churches, I think we're missing out on what God's probably doing, right?
Yeah.
Statistically speaking, globally, the fastest growing church is the global South. So South America, Central
Yeah.
America is where churches are growing the most. It changed recently in the last decade from continental Africa, right? So this is something that I pay attention to. Why is that happening, right?
Mm.
The fastest growing churches in the U.S. are immigrant churches. You have to think about
Yeah.
why, so these are cultures where it's going to be one language that's not English, right? You're kind of thinking about all these things. So
Right.
what would happen when um a discipleship in a colonial way of imitating a culture versus discipleship where it really is presented intentionally and meaningfully, that it's an imitation of Christ. It has to make us examine, who do we think Jesus is?
Yeah.
How do we think Jesus engages interculturally? All those kinds of things, right? I think that
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
worth it for the leaders. It's not something that we have to share with every single person, and everybody needs to be like an intercultural, expert. It's not that, but I do think that there is a cultural aspect of how do we become like an other, for that person or that group's sake, instead of forcing them to mold into so that we feel comfortable. There should be something about a discomfort for the sake of another person
Yeah.
that a Christian or a follower of Christ experiences, right? Imitating the incarnational one means that we have to experience dissent. We have to experience assuming somebody else's clothes, moving into somebody else's neighborhood, right? Understanding a culture, right? To be more like them, not to just go to them, but like there has to be a growth in a discipleship pathway where Christians or a church community understands what it means to be part and with identify with an entire neighborhood community.
Mm.
Like a practical example. I was working with Emmanuel Padilla. He's the executive director for World Outspoken. He does a
I used to
lot of
work with
work.
Emmanuel.
Oh, really? Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, he's like one of my
Yeah.
favorite humans, right? Like
Yeah.
so bright, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And in a lot of his like intercultural church work, right? He gave this great example about how there was this a predominantly white church, a Southern background, and there's a particular way of worshiping, and they really wanted to know their neighbors. And there was another church of Latin background, and when they tried to do a joint worship service, this is where everyone felt offended, right? The predominantly white church comes in and they're muted clothes, very humble. It feels very full of reverence, right? That's what the
Yeah.
worship service experience is like. And then
Mm.
here's this like Latino church that comes in, wild clothes, so much color. Everyone's just yelling, screaming, and both parties were very offended by it. And when you do that in stop and you do that intercultural work of not judging, but trying to understand,
Mhm.
man, there's such a beauty about understanding each culture's reflection of what it means to utterly revere and respect the Holy One.
Yeah.
For that predominantly white culture, they knew that worship meant like, I want to humble myself before the king. I want to not be the first one to speak when I'm in the presence of the one that like gave his life for me, right? This is the context it's coming from. In the Latino church, they're just like, when we have a venerated, superstar in our mix, we want to go all out for them. It's a
Mm.
huge celebration. It should feel like the biggest party. That's how we honor someone in our culture, right? Both parties were doing the same thing. Both were actually worshiping the king, right?
Right.
But they were doing it from a cultural aspect. Now,
Yeah.
if you set it into a viewpoint of like what is right or wrong, colonialism will say that one is right and one is wrong,
Right.
right? One has to
Yeah.
lose a voice, take the second seat, obliterated language, don't know their culture, and be assimilated into another one. But mostly it's because out of comfort,
Yeah.
right? I think imitating Jesus and moving into a neighborhood, that would have actually insisted on both of those culture-based worshipers to want to know and experience each other's way of revering God.
Yeah. Would you say one of the basic problems, at least I've taught a course on ideology. And usually the way I talk about ideology is it closes things off too quickly and claims to be more complete than it actually is. And so what you end up with is a closed system that ignores a lot of what else is going on and says, no, this is the only system that exists. This is the right system, usually is the way it's phrased. And it sounds to me like that's what you're describing with some of these dynamics of intercultural worship, is that one side is going to ultimately say, no. Reverence actually does look like this. What you're doing is a distortion and an inappropriate way of reverencing God. Whereas instead of just looking at it and going, no, these are both appropriate expressions. I just happen to be more comfortable with one. And so now how do we learn to bear with one another in, sort of the back half of Romans, let's say, the last few chapters of Romans, how do we get our heads around those to bear with one another in these more tense situations that are going to create discomfort, not necessarily argument or disagreement, but certainly yeah, just a discomfort, sitting there. I can remember going to I went to Cuba in 1999, and it was right when churches were able to worship publicly. And so we went to a worship service and we're standing shoulder to shoulder, chest to back with groups of people. And I mean, they're going crazy for the Lord. They're just worshiping like crazy. And I'm getting hot and sweaty. And, this is not my scene at all. Right. Like I don't even like the outdoors that much. And we're standing in this, bricked up church, no roof, like nothing's finished. But as uncomfortable as I was, it was sort of infectious. Now, it wasn't something that I would probably choose to do. It's just not, I don't know that yeah, it's just not me, right? It's sort of like throwing me into a yoga class. It's probably not going to happen.
Mhm.
But, but there was an appreciation there, and I could understand why they were doing it, and really appreciated their excitement. But we have trouble because we have the option of segmenting, or at least we have had the option of segmenting. We've generally been able to sort of distance ourselves from one another sufficient that we don't have that discomfort. Is that a
Yeah,
does
I
that
think,
ring
I mean,
true?
yes, absolutely. No matter how much people say that it was for noble reasons, why we have like a million denominations in the Protestant, we know
Right.
why. What
Right.
is the hardest thing when a new pastor comes in a remissioning context in an established church?
Yeah.
What's the worship style? What's the musical worship style we're going to be using? You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Are you going to change that, right? Yeah. No, I mean, when I was in East Africa, and I attended a Lutheran church, it was not like any Lutheran church in the United States of America. I will tell you that. People are wearing the same kind of robes, but they come in and they're like, it's a whole party line, parading, and then the whole worship service ends up, everybody gets into this Congo line
Yeah.
outside, drums out. And I like was weeping because I'm
Yeah.
just like, I I I was worried that I was going to go into a colonized setting, and I was so pleasantly surprised
That
that
it
that
wasn't.
didn't happen,
Yeah.
right? That it really, really wasn't, right? And
Yeah.
so I really, really value the Lutheran churches, like going into Tanzania, you know what I mean? And like really, really, it's not even giving permission. I just feel like they did that incarnational work in that area of the world well, right?
Yeah.
I am sure that there were so many conversations and giving up of things that people felt uncomfortable around, right? And then that's the result of it, right? In my local context in Hawaii, this is like a really, really big theme because, our state's history was an overthrowing of the Hawaiian monarchy. And when you talk to Indigenous Hawaiians about who is at fault, it usually is going to be white business people from America, or it's going to be white missionaries.
Mm.
So a lot of the Christians here in my local context, they really wrestle. Like, are they Hawaiian Christians? Are they Christian Hawaiians? There is an identity piece that feels disparate to them. And for
Mm.
me, if you trace it back, it's because of how colonized Christianity was when it was presented here, right?
Yeah.
And it's a place where like their Hawaiian language, dance, culture, foods, everything was obliterated. It was illegal and punishable to speak in Hawaiian, to write in Hawaiian, to dance hula, anything like that, right? Because it was deemed by Christian missionaries as non-Christian or not Christ-like. Fast forward now, one of the churches I work with here is it's the Queen's Church. It's one of the oldest churches in Hawaii called Kawaiahawa Church, and the last reigning monarch in Hawaii was a Christian. Queen Lugalani was a Christian. She loved her people. She loved God. She wrote all of these hymns in Hawaiian because she loved Jesus and wanted to connect, her people to God also, right? But this church stands as such an act of resistance because every week in their worship service, they're singing traditional hymns, but it's all in Hawaiian. They
Yeah.
will cut people any sort of special music or whatever. It's all in hula. and it's beautiful. I attend and I do not understand not one word people are singing, right?
Right, right.
Because scripture is going to be read in Olelo, Hawaii, right? All of that, and people are dancing barefoot. If you're going to be the preacher for that week, then you have to be barefoot to come behind that pulpit. All of that. But like,
Yeah,
I love it because it's such an act of social justice as Christians and as an Indigenous Hawaiian. And they're saying that like we can take up space and the kingdom of God has room for us, that we will worship our God through the beauty of the culture that he gave us. I weep when I go to their services. It's such a testament to like resistance and a way that they love God, that they're trying to put these two tense pieces together, out of such a story of lament. Like going back to lament, yes, I think absolutely if lament and celebration are not key parts of how Christians or Christ followers behave in the world, who else would be holding that for people, for humanity?
yeah,
Right? In our local context, all of our we don't have often many public worships gatherings, but we have it about once a quarter to once a month. But when we do, we make it so that a prayer of lament, is a central part. It's not the sermon. I still have never given a sermon since I started the second church plant on purpose in order to center discipleship, right? But we
yeah,
make that prayer of lament, and it's always given by a local woman leader in
yeah,
our church, right? And guess what? Everybody always remembers after that public gathering. Everybody remembers that this is a church that holds space for the entire community to hold lament, because there's so many things to grieve about
yeah,
these days, right?
yeah. I I want to come back to one issue, but just want to say I really love the idea of not giving a sermon, and not because I'm anti-sermon or something like that. But there are so many times when I walk into an organization and you can just tell that they're going to use one single practice as a crutch. And it doesn't matter whether that practice is good or it's bad or it's ugly, like it doesn't matter. It's just going to be the crutch. And I always want to just kick it out from under the like every time. I've learned to do it sort of artfully and kindly. Right.
James, we
But
should consult together.
yeah.
I think I would have fun with you.
But it's just I mean I think about if you've read Lauren Winner's book on the dangers of Christian practice. But these things can become so embedded and ingrained in the way that we think about our faith that sometimes we just need to stop doing them in order that we can rethink our faith, come back, reform those practices, and draw them back into the community in a way that is um, in less danger of deforming us and deforming those practices themselves. And so I just wanted to say that I love that idea. It's super cool because I think, oftentimes we're trying to figure out, well, how do we fit in X? And it's like, well, there's usually only one way to fit in something new. You get rid of something else. And so it's a question of value. We always have the room. It's just something else is going to have to eke out, one Sunday or two Sundays or what have you.
Yeah.
So I love that thought.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
will give a fair a caution for leaders, especially more of the, apostolically wired folks in the world, right?
yeah,
Where it's just like, oh, yeah, that's like a free, like clean slate, then we'll just go and like out with the old, in with the new, right? I'm just like, our first call, if we're like blessed to be in a leadership role, and are caring for God's people, right, in that manner.
yeah,
you know I like working with a lot of leaders. The frustration point ultimately will get to a point about their people,
yeah,
right? It's like, I want all these new things to happen, but it's like, my people aren't ready and all this stuff. And I'm just like, I think that we should probably take to heart, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I always call him Dietrich Bonfire because, like, you just like feel that scorching from him, right? But when he says that, like, leaders should not ever complain about their people, ever, and for sure don't ever complain to God about his people. You know what I mean? There's like such a tenderness he has for the church, right? And I'm just like, I'm always like, our starting point as leaders is whoever God gave us now. It's
Yeah.
never to wish for different kinds of people. It's
Yeah.
never to wish for a different kind of neighborhood that our church resides in, right? That is our starting point. And
Yeah.
then that helps to inform how to go about implementing change, right?
That's right.
But also at a rate that our people can handle and tolerate, right? There
Yeah.
should be included in the vision for flourishing for the neighborhoods is that I want to do this work, this good work with the people that God has given me now. I
Yeah.
want them in 5 to 10 years to be the people who are discipled and they're imitating Christ strategically, thoughtfully, intentionally, lovingly, compassionately for and uniquely for this neighborhood, right? So
Yeah.
I think that the starting point really is like really examining where our people are at now, and
Mm.
then building from there, right? Where are
Yeah.
those like maybe perhaps missing discipleship imitation of Christ elements, and where are they like excelling at? And start there, and then build from there.
It's really good to hear you say that. When I've thought through this, I have a background as a personal trainer. And so I used to work one-on-one with different fitness clients, and they all had different goals and different bodies, and just, all that kind of stuff is all different. And so you're not doing a cookie cutter program. You're not writing it up for everyone and then just implementing it. Everybody gets their own separate, distinctive programs. And then you progress them, right? You push them a little bit. It's like, if you can add 5 pounds to the bar, let's add 5 pounds to the bar and see how that does. But you're not going to bring them in and go, oh, okay, here, let me throw 350 on the bench and throw you underneath it. Go ahead. You just don't do that to people. It is a slower progression, and you do try to tailor it as much as possible to them while also challenging them to move forward. And I think that resonates with me a lot, the way you're describing it, to say that it does need to be not a tailored system, but a tailored vision for the people that you're shepherding, to guide them from point A to point B and then on from there, and really cultivating in them an imitation of Christ.
Yeah, and I think that the only addition would be that
Yeah,
uh, it's the tailor fit for the entire community,
correct.
right? That a
Yeah,
discipleship pathway, like everyone can a pathway makes it so that everyone can be at different stages for sure,
yeah,
but there is a clarity in where we're going,
yeah,
right? There's a clarity about that we're all kind of doing the same thing, right? We're all trying to work out the same thing so that it's not so dependent on that one leader, right?
yeah.
Like most of the
That's
times,
good.
and like, yeah, another way that I describe discipleship is that if the leader finally gets a point that the church exists for the sake of the community or neighborhood it resides in, right? If that is a clear mentality, right? Then what's that bridge that connects the church to the community and the community to the church? Most of the time, people think that there has to be other kinds of leaders, people who are better at neighborhood conversations, or you know what
Right.
I mean, like
Yeah.
who joined the council or something like that, like city council, and they put leadership at that as that bridge. For me, I'm just like, it's actually discipleship that bridges and
Yeah.
connects the church to the community, and vice versa. You're trying to train up and equip God's people so that they know how to be the bridge between God's community and a
Yeah.
community that they want to live on behalf of, right? Like
Yeah.
one day it will become merged together, right? You're kind of thinking about what is the kingdom of God? It's heaven and earth converging together, right? In a really similar sense, like the church community and the community it resides in should be converging together. And everybody's going to flourish, right? Are we equipping people in our churches to get to that point? Do they have both a deep, deep spiritual confidence? They know God, love God, have a deep, deep relationship with God, have a full confidence in Him, in their identity in Him. But also, is that deep spiritual confidence tethered to social competence? Do they know how to live and act like God in the world? Right? A lot of Christians, you can test that question out by like, hey, how many non-Christian friends do you have?
Yeah.
What do you mean, right? Like that becomes a
Right.
stop point for people.
Yeah. Well, I want to circle back around because I had one question for you with regard to the colonial aspect. So we were talking about previously. So just as When I look at scripture and I read the various stories, let's say like the Exodus in the Old Testament, right? What you see is the transformation and freedom of a people who come out of slavery where they're unable to worship God to a setting in which they're given a set of guidelines and a structure and a life in God's presence that allows them now to worship God, gives them for lack of a better term, a map, right? A system or something like that to help them worship God. But outside the context of the Exodus, and this is often cited in, I would say, in liberation theology does it an awful lot. But then I would also argue that this is deeply embedded in, let's say, just the American story, where we see the use of the Exodus early on in American history in its breakage or cleavage from the Church of England and Great Britain. The Exodus is something that the American colonists grabbed hold of and said, well, we're the oppressed, they're the oppressors. We need to break free so that we can do our own thing. And what's missing in that equation is always this sort of transformative aspect on the other side, where the Israelites were not freed to do whatever they felt like doing. They were freed now to obey God. They were freed to worship God. They were free to live into this. As we think about colonialism and we think about, some of the dynamics there where we've had this setting where white Christianity has been sort of the top dog, let's say, for a very long time. And I think we're going to start seeing multicultural groups, multicultural congregations sort of emerge and become more of those top dogs. Do you have any advice for those groups to say, don't make the same mistakes that the white church did? How do we avoid that weird dynamic where it's just a reversal, but there's no transformation? Does that make sense?
James Spencer, this is my favorite conversation by far. Thank you so much for asking awesome questions. Yeah, Soong-Chan Rah, I think he's probably one of the top thinkers about this kind of dynamism in the church.
Yeah,
He's followed it and studied it historically up to a current context, right? And so he always uses this phrase that a lot of churches, and I think this is true of both any church, right? If you're that is moving away from something, let's say, exodusing away from something,
right.
but then they run into, they're like, he's always like, they're just stuck in Noah's Ark. He
Yeah.
talks about
Yeah,
the
that's good.
architecture of
Yeah, that's
churches.
good.
You look up in the ceiling, it's like it looks like an upside down boat. You're just like stuck in. Churches are designed to be arcs, right? We're still in Genesis. Is that where we are, people? Right? And I'm just like, oh, it's so poignant to think about. Our church is
Yeah,
supposed to be these like isolated groups that to
right,
multiply just from within, and then what? Oh, then we'll take over the world and become an empire. Like, is that why we're trying to
right.
grow, right? Like, or is the church supposed, like, you can see, I can understand why historically even for American churches, right,
Yeah,
it predominantly was for religious freedom,
sure.
a breaking away from it, right? Like, I can understand that, right? A lot of the immigrant church stories are so that, and like I do a lot of work with Black and brown church leaders, and there is a sentiment where like church has become a place where like we actually have power. We
Yeah.
can actually hold power. We can
Mm,
actually exercise power. Like, there's a deep like respect for that. I can understand why people do not want to change any of that, right? It comes
yeah,
out of that kind of story, right? But I think that it begs that discipleship will demand to ask that question.
yeah.
What are you running? What are you moving away from, and what are you moving towards?
Word.
If it isn't towards a community, a robust community of faith, who is willing to work out what it means to bear with one another, because loving one another is the only thing that Jesus left us with that will tell an outside world who he is, right? That's the only thing that he wants to identify himself with, is how does a community of people love one another? How does a community of people work out living on for the sake of their neighbors out of that loving and bearing with one another, right? If that's what the church ought to be, then it can't just become this isolated Noah's Ark group.
Yeah,
It'll grow.
yeah,
It will grow and multiply, I'm sure, right? But that's not what we were set apart for, right?
yeah,
That's the question, right? What are we
yeah.
set apart for?
So it has to be that discipleship emphasis and just continually looking at it and asking yourself, are we really conforming ourselves more closely to the image of Christ, imitating him, or are we seeking to conform people to our own culture, to our own norms, to our own values, regardless of whether those align with Christ?
Yes. Yeah. And that is like, yeah, I just think that, you know, in the book I talk about, it because it's not a program, right? It's not an emphasis on a discipleship program. It can
Yeah.
be turned into that, but a pathway, right? What are some frameworks that pathways require? Discipleship or imitation of
Yeah.
Christ should mean that every person who is being discipled in my local church, intentionally, meaningfully, they will mature in Christ-like character, the Christ-like theology. How does Jesus think about God? It should
Mm.
be the primary thing that we should be following after, right? How does Jesus engage with wisdom, right? What does Christ-like wisdom in my world today, in my local context, look like? And Christ-like sentence or missional living. Those are, I think, the four main things that everyone should have some sort of a skeleton around. There are unique versions of it because every local context is going to have a different flavor, right? But
Yeah.
I think that those are the four key marks of maturity that every church leader should think about and imagine. What does Christ-like character, theology, wisdom, sentence look like in my local context now? And then you go to, therefore, what should these core essentials be in my church? Love God, love people. It fits into that 1000%. It really,
Right.
really does, right?
Right.
But what does loving God look like, and how does it shape my character?
Right.
Right? We should have, for me, I'm just like, when the pandemic hit, I'm like,
Yeah.
one of my mentors was like, oh, you're kind of loving this, right? And I'm like, why are you outing me? Right. But I knew that she knew what I was thinking, because she's just like, finally, everybody will be living up to that urgency that you always feel about, will Christians step up to the plate now?
Yeah.
Right? I'm
Yeah.
just like, this is a moment just like the plagues in Rome, right?
Yeah.
When it was Christians who were the only ones who stayed on behalf of those who were sick, those who were marginalized, those who were orphaned, widowed. And that's what made Christianity come to the map globally, right? Empires and kingdoms finally
Right.
looked at a tiny little cult and were like, there's something about this, right? About
Yeah.
this group of people. And then
Yep.
it multiplied, right? I thought that that was going to be the moment. I thought that our modern time plague was what was going to
Mhm.
make the church finally step up, right?
Yeah.
Um, our church, because obviously we centered discipleship, our church actually grew. We because throughout the pandemic, we started with one tiny missional community,
Yeah.
for folks who follow missional community patterns and things. But we were at three at that time around the pandemic, and then 6 years later we've multiplied to nine. We're gonna end with 12 by year's end, because discipleship was centered, not a worship service. We
Right.
never had an immediate, how do we stream our service? How do we,
Right.
our
Right.
people their first questions really, to me, I was like, oh my gosh, how do we gather people? That's what I was thinking, right? Because like,
Right.
how do you grow a church? You grow gatherings, right?
Right.
But my
Exactly.
people, because they were discipled in character, theology, wisdom, sentence, they were immediately asking, who are our neighbors? How do we like stand with them, right? This is how a lot of our communities around like senior and elderly care. Three of our missional communities is all around low income senior living facilities,
Yeah.
and we serve 500 people. And now, years later, it's the seniors who are discipling one another. They have
Yeah.
discipleship groups of their own, and they're talking about, how do we serve our neighbors? How do we love our neighbors? How do we tell
Yeah.
them about God's story, right? All those kinds of things, right? And I'm just like, oh,
Yeah.
yep. No matter how much I will think that, "Ugh, should I be giving a sermon?" There's like that tension. Of course there is,
Of
right? There
course.
is.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I kind of miss that. I used to do it like every single week.
Right.
But like, man, when I hear those kinds of stories about my people, and none of these people know who I am. I'm the
Mm.
senior pastor, of a church that caters to 650 people today. And I will assure you, it's only the leaders who know me. There's 25
Yeah.
people who know me, and that's it.
That's really cool. there's something in what you said that I just want to make sure we don't lose. And then I have one more question for you, and then we'll close it out. But one thing you said, because your people were discipled, because you were centered on discipleship, a lot of these decisions that other churches were making, you didn't need to make. It was a much easier uh, transition or just dynamic movement into the pandemic and all that that entailed for you all. I think so many times the problems that we're trying to solve are unsolvable because we've closed ourselves off to the opportunities that discipleship might bring. We just don't have the right posture in the world, and so we can't see the openings that God is giving us. We're just trying to be over here and solve these little puzzles ourselves without that disciple posture, without eyes to see and ears to hear. We just don't have the sense making apparatus in place to sit back and say, this really isn't the problem. We could just do this. But it sounds like, I'm sure your church is imperfect in a number of different ways, but it sounds like there's a fantastic way that you've figured out how to center that discipleship and give your people a different way of looking at the world so that some of these problems that other churches were facing, you simply didn't face. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I will say one for sure. We have
Yeah.
lots and lots of flaws.
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that. Number two, like, man, I think my own pride and ego, of course, was hit, right? Like
Yeah.
I was freaking out like every other senior pastor during the pandemic. Why? Because in the US, it hit in March, and just around the corner was Easter. It's the
Right.
biggest event of the year for
Yeah.
churches, right? And I was
Yeah. Yeah.
also thinking that. I literally thought this is what's going to put our tiny little church plant that doesn't make sense in the world to finally be on the map. And now people were like, wow, that is a real church, right? That was the
Yeah.
temptation that I was facing and wrestling with as a leader, right? Like
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
I can, till I'm blue in the face, be like, oh no, it was so easy. No, of course not. It wasn't.
Right.
It was my own people asking me questions that I did not think that they were going to ask.
Yeah.
We were that year we were going to be poised to do this like Easter gathering. We're going to talk about Jesus. We anticipated 100 people in this awesome, trendy, craft beer joint. Like we knew the owners. It was going to be super awesome. I'm like,
Yeah.
finally, this is going to be so great, right? We were going to do that. And then, pandemic shut down everything. And I knew that I was like mourning it. Like I was really grieving that loss of an opportunity. And then
Yeah.
when my people started asking different questions, like, literally I was anticipating 100 people that Easter Sunday. We served and had contact with 1,000 people. We had 100 volunteers packaging foods, right? We served 500, and then we served another thing. Like it was mind-boggling to me. I felt like after that, like usually Easter Sundays pastors are high-fiving one another. We
Yeah.
did it. It was awesome. The numbers, blah blah blah. I was repenting because I felt like Jesus was like, if you trusted me enough, talking
Yeah.
back about, a
Yeah.
trust with God, right? So
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
trusted me enough, see how you experience like the parable of the sower. You
Right.
put it into good soil,
Yeah.
and you had to wait a long time. But man, if you really want to experience the kingdom of God, it is like 30, 60, 100 fold. Like I
Yeah.
felt repentant because I thought I was losing something in my ministry, right? And yet,
Right.
God was inviting me to something else because I did a slow grow move of just focusing on a small number of people and just intentionally discipling them through a discipleship pathway.
Very cool. Well, I have a question I ask all my guests at the end of the episodes, and so I want to ask you as well. What do you think Christians need to be thinking about in order to be and make disciples more faithfully in our contemporary world?
Mm. I think that if people are going to be thinking mostly about asking this question, uh, uh, God, where are you already at work in my neighborhood?
Mm,
And how would you like me to participate? That is one of the things that question based that we equip all of our people in. And
love it.
man, Everybody, every Christian, every Christ follower asking that question, the gospel truly, truly will be the answer for every brokenness in the world if every Christian was asking that question.
That is an excellent answer. Thank you very much. And thanks for being on the podcast today. This has been really fun. I enjoyed your book. I would recommend Eun's book to anyone out there. You'll get the link in the show description. But thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate
James Spencer, you were the best interviewer by far. I
it.
really mean it. Thank you for awesome questions.
Well, I will take that endorsement and we'll call it an episode. So thanks everybody for being here with us on Thinking Christian.